Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Gunatitamanam Chidananda Rupam Chidabhasakam Sarvagam Dhyanagamyam Munidhyeyam Akasha Rupam Paresham Parabrahma Rupam Ganesham Vajema. Team Param Vedanta extends a warm welcome to the 55th session of Bhagavad Gita, verse by verse. Today is Uttana Ekadasi. Uttana Ekadasi is also known as Kshiravdi Ekadasi and Yogeshwara Ekadasi. It is the 11th lunar day of Kartika month. Uttana represents waking up. It is the day Lord Vishnu, who was sleeping in Yoga Nidra, that is cosmic sleep, starting from Ashada Ekadasi, wakes up on this day. Uttana Ekadasi at the individual level may be considered as waking up from ignorance of Maya. The individual Jiva finding the Vasudeva in him, realizing the Sakshi. The day following Uttana Ekadasi, that is tomorrow, is Uttana Dvadasi. Tulsi Puja is celebrated on this day by performing marriage of Pratika or Pratima, representing Vishnu, and Tulsi, representing Prakriti, nature. Tulsi Puja symbolizes the union of universal consciousness and Prakriti. Coming back to today's session, we continue our foray into the 8th chapter and cover verses 13 to 17 in today's session. The verses will be explained by Srimati Purnima, Dr. Sundar, Dr. Divakar, Sri Madhusudan, and Sri Bhaskar. As always, our revered teacher, Dr. Timmappa Hegde sir, will enrich the presentations with his valuable insights. Today's verses will be chanted by Srimati Smita Pai. Let's tune into the essence of these verses and chant along. Before we begin today's session, Dr. Meenal will briefly take us through the 5 verses covered in the previous session. Dear friends, in the next 1 hour, let's have nothing but Krishna on our mind, because Krishna has said, as a person thinks, so he becomes, and a Nishkama Upasaka thinking of God becomes one with God. Over to you, Dr. Meenal.
Namaste. Arjuna asked Krishna 7 questions. The 7th question was about Antakale or Prayanakale Ishvara Smaranam. Verse numbers 5 to 14 of the 8th chapter deal with this 7th question only, that is the significance and the method of remembering God at the time of death. Why is Prayanakale Ishvara Smaranam important? Our habits are determined by our lifestyle, and the lifestyle as well as our personality will determine a person's last thought just before death. Therefore, the last thought is an indicator of a person's overall lifestyle, and this very last thought will also determine the next janma or the destiny of the person. This is brought forth by a very beautiful proverb: watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your habit. Watch your habit, for it becomes your character. Watch your character, because it becomes your destiny. Good and healthy habits, including Ishwar Smaranam, must be inculcated right from the onset, or at least as early as possible, so that with daily practice, that is Nitya Abhyasa, we are able to remember Ishwara spontaneously and subconsciously, even at the time of our last breath. So Antakale Ishwara Smaranam is possible only by Nitya Abhyasa, regular practice in our day-to-day life. This is the method of Antakale Ishvara Smaranam. What is the significance of Prayanakale Ishvara Smaranam? When a Nishkama Saguna Ishvara Upasaka remembers God at the time of death, he or she is able to obtain Krama Mukti. To do so, a sadhaka must be a Nishkama Upasaka, that is a sadhaka whose only goal is spiritual or Ishwar Prapti and not materialistic goals. Initially, of course, a sadhaka may start as a Sakama Upasaka, but with bhakti comes Vairagya, and Vairagya will convert a Sakama Sadhaka into a Nishkama Upasaka. It is to be noted that the 8th chapter is the only unique chapter of Bhagavad Gita which discusses Saguna Ishvara Upasana and Krama Mukti. It does not deal with Nirguna Ishvara or Sadhyo Mukti like the rest of the Gita chapters. At the time of death, the Saguna Nishkama Upasaka remembers the Saguna Ishvara of his or her choice. And then with meditation and yogic skills acquired by practice and Nitya Abhyasa, the sadhaka must withdraw the prana from every organ of the body and bring it to the heart. And then from the heart, it should be brought to the center of eyebrows, Bhur Madhye. And from here, the prana must be brought through a special channel called Sushumna Nadi to the top of the head at a particular spot, which is called Brahmarandram here, which literally means pathway to Brahmaloka. And from here, the prana must be projected onwards to the Shukla Gati, which will lead the Jivatma to Brahmaloka, where the Jivatma attains knowledge about Nirguna Ishvara from none other than Brahmaji himself. Only after acquiring Nirguna Ishvara Jnanam, the Jivatma will get Mukti or Videha Mukti. This stepwise Mukti is what is called Krama Mukti. If a Jivatma realizes or gains knowledge about the Nirguna Ishvara during his or her lifetime only, he or she will get an instant Mukti, which is called Akrama Mukti or Sadhyo Mukti. One must remember that Mukti or Moksha is not possible without knowing Nirguna Ishvara. With this background, let us take a recap of verse numbers 8 to 12, which we studied in our last session of the chapter 8. In the 8th verse, Krishna says, O Arjuna, constantly thinking of the Lord with a mind that is undistracted due to the practice of meditation, one attains the divine supreme Lord. At the time of death, that is Antakale Smaranam, is of course implied here. In the 9th verse, Shri Krishna mentions the attributes of Saguna Ishvara that the sadhaka will attain by Antakale Ishvara Smaranam. And the attributes listed here are omniscient, ancient, karma phaladata, subtler than an atom, sustainer of everything in this universe, incomprehensible or achintya rupam, effulgent like the sun and beyond ignorance. In verse numbers 10, 11 and 12, Shri Krishna talks about the method of Prayanakale Ishvara Smaranam, which we have just discussed. In the 10th verse, Krishna tells Arjuna that by yogic practice, the sadhaka must bring the prana to the center of the eyebrows and simultaneously keep the mind focused and undistracted, full of devotion at the time of death. The 11th verse is all about the glory of God, whom all the Vedas, the Vedantic students, and the Vedic experts call as Aksharam. Aksharam means the absolute reality. And although Krishna promises to tell Arjuna about this imperishable goal or Aksharam in this verse only, he gives the actual description much later in verse numbers 20, 21, and 22 of this chapter. In the 12th verse, Krishna continues his advice on the method of Antakale Ishvara Smaranam. He says, having restrained all the sense organs and having confined the mind to the heart, having fixed one's pranas on the top of the head, one should take to yogic concentration like Omkara Upasana, which Sri Krishna will discuss in the upcoming verses. Thank you very much. Hari Om.
Thank you, Dr. Meenal, for a very fluent and a very simple recap of the verses that we studied in the last class. Sadashiva Samarambam Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. As we just saw in the recap by Dr. Meenal, this is a very unusual Gita chapter. All other chapters of the Gita, Krishna wants us to work for Mukti or Jivan Mukti in this life itself. But elsewhere in the scriptures, another path is given, and that is what is called Krama Mukti. And how does a person work for Krama Mukti? The focus in this chapter is on Upasana, that is meditation on God with form. Upasana, as explained already, is of two types. Initially, sakama, that means I want something from God. Thereafter, once you develop a certain vairagya, I want God and God alone, nothing else. A person does not seek anything other than God, and such a person becomes a nishkama upasana. In all other chapters, thanks to Guru and Shastra, a person then moves from upasana to jnana yoga and works for mukti in this life itself. But if this opportunity is not there, this chapter talks about an alternative form of mukti called Krama Mukti. The focus throughout in this chapter is coming to terms with one's own death. Krishna repeatedly assures in the Bhagavad Gita that my devotee, My bhaktas will never perish. I will take care of them. And that is the focus of a sakama, of a nishkama Ishvara upasana in this chapter. Let us look at how is it possible to remember God at the time of death. It is said, what we do every day is what determines our last moments. And therefore, if we are able to remember Ishvara in every activity, even as I'm speaking to you, if I have a real sense of gratefulness that everything is possible because of the blessings of Ishvara, I am very aware of Ishvara in and everything that I do. Such a person lives life 100%. Such a person lives life in the moment, very meditatively, very awarefully. And if you are able to live life meditatively and awarefully, death also becomes a similar process. Now, let us look at Vedantic view of life, which is also the Vedantic view of death. That means the more you understand life, you will be able to understand death. And if you're able to understand death, then death does not become a problem. Because once you know what life is, you will know what death is. Normally, we think life and death are two polar opposites. We think death comes at the end. We think death is against life. Death is the enemy. Somehow, I need to protect myself against death. Now, this idea that death is the enemy is the problem. The more we come to terms, into a sense of acceptance of death, the more we are able to handle death. Let us see how death is an integral part of life. Life exists because of death. Life is a constant process of renewal. Death does not happen in the end alone. Death happens every moment. Each moment I die to the past, I'm born and reborn to the present. We'll take an example of breath, because breath involves both life and death. Each time I breathe in, it is an act of life. When a child is born into the world, the first thing that a child does is to breathe in. And in a way, life begins outside the womb. The last thing a person does if a person has a natural death is to breathe out, and there is no more breathing in. So that is why we use the word expire, both for breathing out and for death. So if you live life moment to moment, you will see every moment I am born, every moment I die. We cannot live if you refuse to die. We cannot breathe in if I refuse to breathe out. So that is the association, and that is why pranayama is such an important technique. So if you understand what life is, we will allow death to happen. We are not going to fight with death. Every moment is a new moment because I died to the past and I'm available to the present. The more you're able to understand what life is, you will see life and death are two aspects of the same coin. So if you welcome life, you will be able to welcome death. If life is good, you know, this is a wrong idea somehow that we have got, that life is good, death is bad, that life has to be desired, death has to be avoided. Somehow we need to protect ourselves against death. So 100% living involves dying, just like I explained about breathing in and breathing out. Now, the next thing is to analyze if death is an integral process of life, who in me is afraid of death? Who in me is against death? Life cannot be afraid of its own integral process. There must be something else in me that is against it. And you will discover it is the ego. Life and death are not opposites. It's ego and death which are opposites. Ego is against both life and ego is against both death. Ego is afraid to live and ego is afraid to die. That is why each step of fuller life is against the ego. So that is why all spiritual teachers warn us about the ego. The more you live life 100%, you will see we come closer to death. Whenever we take risks, whenever we drive fast, you will see at that moment life is so exhilarating. Whenever you're going on a dangerous trekking expedition, you see you are so full of life, but you are also very close to death. Whenever life and death come very close, you will see there is greater life. In love, there is death of the ego, and that is why ego is against love. The death of the ego means real life. The death of the ego is not our death. The death of the ego is the real possibility of life. And that is what is the meaning of a Jivan Mukta. A Jivan Mukta is the only person who's really alive because the ego is no longer there. So again and again, I'm saying life and death are not polar opposites. The more you understand life is the greater understanding of death. Like day and night, they are not opposites. They are complementary. Death is not the end of the life. It is a completion. It is a crescendo. We will see in subsequent classes that how if you live life according to Vedic instructions, life is not going to be that you go up and then you come down, 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 decay and death. But if life is fully lived, it is going to be an exponential curve all the way up, where the end can be a climax and a grand finale. Vedanta says that we have been there from the very beginning. If there is a beginning, we will be there till the very end if there is an end. It is impossible to tell when life starts. And if you do not know where life starts, you cannot tell where life ends. We have been there for all time. We are eternity. We are there for all time. Now, what we call life is an identification with a certain body. What we call death is getting out of that form, getting out of that body, getting out of that concept. The problem is we may get too identified with this particular body. We change houses, we change cities, but if you get too identified with one particular house, leaving that house can be very painful. That is why the essence of all Vedanta is I am someone other than the body. This identification we need to work on again and again. Death is beautiful only for those who have lived their lives fully, those who have loved, those who have lived a life of celebration. And then the only way to teach us is to teach you how to die gracefully, is to teach us how to live life fully. That is why the more we live a life of gratefulness, awareness, the sense of Ishvara in every moment of our life, death will not become painful. Vedanta says, if I am not the body, then who am I? All this we will discuss in all the other chapters. I am the infinite Sat, the infinite Chit. My real nature is of the nature of consciousness of Aham Brahma Asmi. And therefore, what is the message of all Vedanta? Work as if we are going to live forever. Live as if you're going to die today. With this background, let us look into the verses of the 8th chapter, beginning with verse 13. Purnima, please.
Gurubhyo Namaha. From the 5th verse of this 8th chapter, Lord has been answering Arjuna's question regarding remembrance of the Lord at the time of death. To remember Lord at the time of death, one has to be a Nishkama Upasaka. Nishkama Upasaka is the one who practices meditation on Ishvara, the infinite God, and considers Ishvara as the primary goal of life. According to the law, which Krishna said, Yam yam bhavam smarati, tam tam bhavam prapnoti, which means as a person thinks, so he becomes. Since the Nishkama Upasaka thinks of God, he becomes one with God. Krishna clarifies about this later. Next slide, sir. He says, after death, this Nishkama Upasaka will go to Brahma Loka, obtain Nirguna Ishvara Gnanam, and as a result will get Jivatma Paramatma Aikyam. This method of Ishvara Prapti, as Swami Param says, is Krama Mukti. This infinite God is represented by many finite symbols. Some of them are Ishta Devatas like Rama, Krishna, etc., known as Pratima symbols. Some are Pratika symbols like a flame, Shivalingam, Saligrama, etc. Omkara is one such Pratika symbol. So Krishna is taking the example of Omkara Upasana in the following verse. Om ityekaksharam brahma vyaharan mam anusmaran yah prayati tyajan deham sayati paramam gatim. Chanting the single syllabled Om, which is Brahman, thinking of me, he who departs, leaving the body, attains the supreme goal. The Vedic scriptures state that at the beginning of creation, God first created sound. With sound, he created space and then continued with the rest of the creation process. That primordial sound was the sacred syllable Om. It is also called Pranava, the sound manifestation of the Brahman. The Brahman, which is Aksharam, which is imperishable. It represents the formless aspect of the Supreme Lord. It is also called Anahat Nada and often attached to the beginning of the Vedic mantras as Bija mantra, similar to Rim, Klim, etc. For proper chanting of the sacred word Om, the emphasis is on the vibrations of the three letters A, U, and Ma. One starts by making an A sound from the belly with an open mouth and throat. It then merges into a U sound created in the middle of the mouth. Finally, it ends in chanting Ma with a closed mouth. Swami Param says it does not necessarily mean one has to utter Om only. He can utter any other name that a person has practiced throughout his life. The time of death is the final test of our meditation. As death is said to be intensely painful, so despite the pain, one who is able to focus on God, even at that last moment, attain Him. He travels with God, accompanied by God, goes through a special path which Krishna explains later as the Shuklagati. So, what travels is the subtle and causal body, Sukshma and Karana Sharira, in which all the Punya and Papa Karmas are stored. The Stula Shariram, that is the physical body, does not travel because it has to be dropped here. And Atma, the consciousness, cannot travel because it is all pervading. So, this is the Jivatma consisting of Sukshma Sharira and the reflected consciousness that travel towards the highest goal of life, towards Krama Mukti, by which we mean going to Brahmaloka and gaining knowledge and liberation. However, to achieve such a state is very difficult. It requires continuous practice throughout one's life. It should become a habit of remembering God at all times and being in total awareness every moment. The merciful Krishna shows us an easier path in the next verse. Hari Om Sir, Krishna Arpanamastu.
Thank you, Purnima, for a nice explanation of this verse. Om iti ekakshara Brahma. And the importance of remembering Omkara at the time of death and also all through our life. One of the meanings of the word Brahma is the Vedas. It is said when the Devatas wanted to spiritually evolve, Brahmaji gave them the Vedas. They looked at it and said, it is too much. Can you give us something simpler? With a lot of meditation, Brahmaji was able to get the essence of all the Vedas in the form of the Gayatri mantra. And they said, this is also a little tongue twister. Can you give us something simpler? And Brahmaji meditated and brought out the Pranava or Omkara. Omkara is the essence of all Vedanta, and that is the importance of meditating on Omkara. The next verse will be explained to us by Dr. Sundar. Over to you, Dr. Sundar.
Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Ananyacheta satatam yo mam smarati nityashaha tasyaham sulabah partha nityayuktasya yoginaha. As we see in this next slide, this chapter is unique on the discussion on death. This happens in the background of two pathways the Nishkama Upasaka could take. Sakama Upasaka is a person who does selfish activities or karma, whereas the Nishkama Upasaka does selfless activities or karma yoga. At the end of karma yoga, the Nishkama Upasaka gets Chitta Shuddhi or Sadhana Chatustaya Sampatti. At this point, there are two pathways available. If there is benefit of Guru Shastra Upadesha, then through Jnana Yoga, he culminates in Jivan Mukti. For some reason, if he does not have the benefit of Guru Shastra Upadesha, this Nishkama Upasaka then through the process of Krama Mukti attains liberation in Brahmaloka by getting Jnana Yoga through Brahmaji himself. Now the seventh question asked by Arjuna was, what is the significance of remembering God at the time of death? So Lord answers this question in three segments. The first is, why should one remember God at the time of death? This was explained in the verse 5 and 6 where Lord Krishna said, whatever you remember at the time of death, that one shall attain. So by remembering the Lord at the time of death, one attains the Lord. However, it is difficult to remember God at the time of death. So then Lord comes to the second aspect, how to remember God at the time of death. This is dealt with in the verses 7 and 8, where Lord Krishna says, you can practice remembering God at all times, and then automatically you shall remember God even at the time of death. Then we come to the third aspect, how to remember God then at all times. This is the subject matter of this present verse. As we see in this next slide, at the most basic level, this verse says, Yaha mam smarati, who remembers me, tasya aham bhavami, of him I shall become. Yaha, who is further qualified with the adjective ananya chetah and nitya yuktasya yoginaha. So, ananya cheta is a person who has undivided remembrance of the Lord. Undivided means not distracted by any incidental relationship. He always has the God at the back of his mind. Nitya yuktasya, he is always committed to remembering God at all times. Smarati is the verb, it has two adverbs here, satatam and nityasaha, always and continuously remembering God. Aham here is qualified by the adjective sulabaha. So the Lord is telling, if a person is of this description, that he is able to remember at all times, then he shall become the easy one. God shall become the easy one, sulabaha, for him. With this background, in the next slide, let us try to understand a little more how to remember God at all times. On the left side in red is the modus of operation of a Sakama Bhakta who is doing karma. For him, God is a means to attain to worldly ends. Naturally, everybody is focused on the ends, not so much on the means. You focus on the means only when a particular work is to be done. So his connectivity with God is in bits, not continuous. Whereas we see on the right side in green is the Nishkama Bhakta who is doing karma yoga he has understood the futility of following the mode of operation of Sakama Bhakti. So now he has shifted from God as means to world as means, and God is occupying the position of goal for him. Therefore, as one's focus is always on the goal, he has God at the back of his mind always. He practices Karma Yoga, which means he is taking to Ishwararpanam and Ishvara Prasada. Both of these bhavas keep God always at the back of the mind. He has Vishwarupa Darshanam. This again shows that he has God in the back of his mind at all times. Pujya Swami Paramarthanandaji gives this 2-point formula on how to remember God at all times. One is to remember that our primary relationship is with God alone. Our incidental relationship makes us into the various roles that we play through the day. However, our primary relationship makes us a bhakta. So one point is to become a bhakta, have the God at the back of the mind always. The second formula Swamiji gives is there is no individual separate from the total. So everything belongs to God. So change attitude from ownership to trusteeship. This removes all the worries and allows God to be there subconsciously in the back of the mind always. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sundar, for a nice and a complete explanation of this verse, because the more God becomes an integral part of my life, and that's what we learned about the importance of Ishvara in the 7th chapter. God becomes an integral part even at death. And so Sri Krishna says it will become easy to remember God at the time of death. The next verse will be by Dr. Divakar. Over to you, Dr. Divakar.
Thank you, sir. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. With the previous verse, Krishna concludes the answer to the 7th question that Arjuna asks, which is about the Antakala Smarana. In the following verses, Krishna deals with some important topics connected with this discussion. From the verses 15 to 22, Krishna talks about 2 types of human goals. One is the finite material goal called the world, which Krishna calls as Dukkhalaya. And the other is the infinite spiritual goal called the God. Vedas and Bhagavad Gita insists that the right goal to be chosen is the God. This is because all the finite worldly goals, although are wonderful, are embedded with 3 inherent defects or traps. The first one is Dukkha Mishritatvam. Pleasures of the worldly goals are mixed with pains while acquiring, preserving, and ultimately more pains while losing the acquired goals. The second one is the Atripti Karatvam. Any worldly goals acquired will only pave way to setting up of another set of goals. It seems like nothing succeeds like success. But if we carefully analyze this, in the material world, nothing fails like success. Therefore, there is always some atripti, some dissatisfaction associated with the worldly goals. The third is the bandhakatvam. When we accomplish any material goals like money, position, power, identity, etc., without us knowing, we become slaves to them because of the vicious bondage. Therefore, Krishna calls world as Dukkhalayam, the source of all unhappiness, all atripti. Krishna says God alone represents Purnatvam, Swatantratvam, total independence, because when one chooses God as a goal, eventually they will discover that the God is not outside, but the very self, Tat Tvam Asi. Therefore, God dependency is going to be self-dependency. So when one identifies with the self, this Sachidananda Atma, there is no Dukkham, as Atma is the Ananda, the absolute bliss. And there is no Atripti, as Atma is Purnam, and there is no Bandhakatvam, as there is no question of world dependency for the one who is anchored in the self. Therefore, God represents total peace, security, and happiness. So choosing God as a goal is the wisest choice, which Krishna declares in these verses. We will see the verse 8.15 in the next slide. Mamupetya punarjanma dukkhalayama shashvatam napnuvanti mahatmanaha samsiddhim paramam gataha. Krishna gives comparison between two goals, God and the world. He says, Mam upetya. If a person attains me, the Lord, that mahatmanaha, those great people, those who choose God as their goal, those who make a wise choice in their life, such mahatmaha punarjanmana apnuvanti. They will never come back to the material world again. They never return to the mortality again. Here, punarjanma represents finitude, dukkhalayam, the permanent source of the sorrow and unhappiness, which is nothing but the samsara or the world. So, mahatmanaha na apnuvanti samsara. They are never dependent on this impermanent samsara. What happens to such a mahatmas? Paramam siddhim gataha. They have accomplished the highest goal of purnatvam. They have accomplished moksha, that is a liberation from the samsara. So punarjanma na apnuvanti has two meanings. The first is the jnanis don't have another janma. They are out of the punarapi jananam and punarapi maranam cycle, as they have exhausted all their karmas because of their self-knowledge. And the second one is that even within this janma, such mahatmas who depend on the God, such a gnani who is anchored in the self will never depend on the dukkhalaya or the impermanent world for the total peace, happiness, and security. Thank you, sir. Hari Om.
Thank you, Dr. Divakar, for a very nice explanation where you help us to, from the meaning of these verses, to shift our attention from worldly goals to focus on Ishvara as the highest goal. The next verse will be explained to us by Madhusudan. Over to you, Madhu.
Gurubhyo Namaha. Abrahma Bhuvanaloka Punaravrutinarjuna Mamupetya tu Kaunteya Punarjanmana Vidyate. Meaning, all the worlds, O Arjuna, including the realm of the Brahman, are subject to return. But after attaining me, O son of Kunti, there is no rebirth. Swami Chinmaya puts it in a different fashion beautifully. Worlds up to the world of Brahmaji are subject to rebirth, O Arjuna, but he who reaches me has no birth. Here, Krishna clearly declares there is no such a thing called eternal heaven. And by the way, heaven also comes under the finite goals only. In our scriptures, as we would know, we have 6 heavens: Bhuvarlokaha, Suvarlokaha, Maharlokaha, Janalokaha, Tapolokaha, and Satyalokaha. 6 levels of heaven. And in each higher level, the pleasures are higher, security is higher, and it is finer and finer as we progress, the highest being Brahmalokaha. And Krishna says, even that Brahmaloka cannot guarantee total security. It is a characteristic technique often employed by the teacher in the Gita, which is Lord Krishna, to bring home his ideas for the purposes of emphasis against the background of their opposites. Thus, we find here in this verse 2 contradictory factors put in opposition with each other, so that each as a contrast to the other may shine out the best in the mental horizon of the students. Up to the realm of Brahma, all are subject to rebirth. This idea is contrasted with the result of realizing directly and totally the self, the eternal, but after attaining me, there is no birth. As you would see in this chart as exhibited, and therefore Krishna says, hey Arjuna, Punaravrittinaha lokaha. All the 14 lokas exist within the time and space. There is only one thing which is beyond time and space, which is Ishvaraha, otherwise called Brahman in Vedantic language. There is only one thing which is unlocated, whereas the other lokas are within the realm of time and space. That's why you have to travel to reach them. So the very fact that you have to travel indicates that it's not available here. And what about Brahmaloka? He says, Abrahma Bhuvanal Lokaha. To Brahmaloka, even Brahmaji is not permanent here. Even if Brahmaji, the creator, has to get security, he would need to depend upon Gnanam, as we are talking, Gnanam alone. And therefore, everything is ephemeral. Whereas, Mamupetya tu Kaunteya, hey Arjuna, if you come to me, who is beyond time and space, Mamupetya tu Kaunteya, Punarjanmana Vidyate, will give you the permanent security. There is no question of infinite becoming finite. As Swami Paramarthanandaji puts it beautifully, and also shown in the next chart, the theory of gradual liberation, which is Krama Mukti, accepted in Vedanta, says that ritualism, karma, accompanied by meditation, upasana, takes the ego to the realm of the creator, Brahmaloka, where at the end of Kalpa, the cycle of creation and dissolution, it merges with the Supreme. Hari Om. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. That was a nice explanation of another verse which talks about the impermanence of heaven. Because in all religions, it is said that once you reach heaven, you are there permanently. But in the Vedantic view, or the Vedic view, heaven is a place that you go depending upon the amount of punya that you have accumulated. Kshine punya. The moment the punya is exhausted, you come back here. So all these are all temporary. Only God is the permanent abode. The last verse for today will be explained to us by R.V. Bhaskar. Over to you, Bhaskar.
Yeah. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. The verse goes like this. Sahasra Yuga Paryantam Ahar Yed Brahmano Viduhu Ratrim Yuga Sahasram Tam Teho Ratra Vidu Janaha. Well, this sloga intrigues the inquisitive mind, especially students of maths, as it is interspersed with statistics. The introductory data appears simple since it expounds about Brahmaji's day and night tenure. Swami Paramatmananda is emphatic that this sloka refers to Chaturmukha Saguna Brahma. So this slide, please. Yeah. And in lighter vein, Swamiji says, Mr. Saraswati, to amply make it clear, it is not about the Vedantic connotation, Brahman, the super consciousness, formless, infinite, and Nirguna Brahman. The sloka magnifies Brahmaji's single day consisting of 1,000 yugas, and similarly, Brahmaji's night consisting of an equal span of 1,000 yugas. Here, the word yuga refers to Mahayuga, and one Mahayuga contains 4 yugas, which we are very much familiar with: Satya Yuga, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali Yugas. Interestingly, the scriptures draw a time-bound frame for each yuga as follows. Kali Yuga is 432,000 years in length. Dwapara Yuga is twice that of Kali Yuga, that is 864,000 years. Well, Treta Yuga is 3 times that of Kali Yuga, 1,296,000 years. Well, lastly, Satya Yuga is 4 times that of Kali Yuga, 1,728,000 years. Well, the final calculation of one Mahayuga is 4,320,000 years in length. Well, this is just tip of the iceberg. Imagine 1,000 of this is one single day of Brahmaji. That is 4,320,000,000 years. Well, subsequently, Brahmaji's night begins after 4,320,000,000 years of Brahmaji's day. And henceforth, all the creations except Brahmaloka will get destroyed. This is bewildering because you just cannot comprehend this math, but relate this to yourself. When you go to sleep, your world dissolves, isn't it? Well, the same logic is applied to this, where creation goes into oblivion. And when Brahmaji's day begins, well, the process again goes. Perhaps another big bang occurs, wherein a new era begins. Well, science refers this phenomenon as pulsating universe theory. It is said that Brahmaji's longevity is 100 years and is called a kalpa. End of the kalpa is 100 years of Brahmaji. Brahmaloka also gets destroyed. Hence, this signifies that Brahmaloka is finite and limited by time. In fact, Brahmaloka is tagged as supreme amongst all the 6 heavens. Apparently, because of its finite status, and literally, hence, there is nothing eternal heaven at all, as we suppose. Well, supposedly, with all the accumulated punya, you proclaim Brahmaloka, which obviously is perishable. Hence, you need to take a return ticket after your timeshare quota gets exhausted. Swami Chinmayananda says that experience of time is subjective and individualistic. Swamiji asks us to visualize the happy state of mind. And we in ecstasy say that, wow, time literally flies. On the contrary, unhappy moments. And we sadly pronounce, time crawls. Hence, measurement of time is the interval between 2 events. He says, Chinmayanji says, we could categorize Brahmaloka as 1,000 years of happiness. Renowned physicist Albert Einstein stated the general theory of relativity suggests that the space-time expands and contracts depending on the momentum and mass of the nearby matter. It is evident that time dilation effect prevails in space-time. Earth takes 365 days to make one circuit. The closest planet, Mercury, hardly takes 88 days, while the distant planet, Neptune, takes 165 years for one revolution. With this backdrop of science, reiterating the time dilation effect, it is certainly possible for us to believe the rishis who adhered and studied deeply the Shruti. Well, the sloka was echoed and extolled by these people who know the very meaning and the essence of life, or the astronomical, or the heavenly, whatever it is. Well, rishis and munis of yoga have to be really regarded as our gurus. Well, Swami Paramatmananda says that this verse extrapolates, saying presently Brahmaji has just completed 50 years. That is half of his 100 years rule. Well, Brahmaloka is 27 or 28 Chaturvyas. Well, the subsequent verses will give us more details about the subject. Hari Om.
Thank you, Sri Bhaskarji, for a nice explanation of a verse which talks about the longevity of Brahmaji. It is extremely difficult to comprehend this unit of time, but what it really tries to convey is that anything created, and Brahmaji is it is created by Vishnu. So anything that is created in time will perish in time, and so anything created, anything other than God is temporary, and therefore we need to shift from anything worldly to godly. The next class will be from 18 to 23 of the 8th chapter, where we come across some of the most beautiful verses of the 8th chapter, where, as I said, every chapter has certain goalpost or signpost verses indicating of a higher nature, and you will see such verses, as at least a string of 3 of them, in the next class. We'll conclude by chanting these verses by Smita Pai. Over to you, Smita.
Thank you, Doctor. Omityekaksharam Brahma Vyaharan Brahmam Anusmaran Yah Prayati Tyajan Deham Sayati Paramam Gatim Ananyachetaha Satatam Yo Mam Smarati Nityashaha Tasyaham Sulabhah Partha Nityayuktasya Yoginaha Mam Upetya Punarjanma Dukkhalayam Ashashvatam Napnuvanti Mahatmanaha Samsiddhim Paramam Gataha Abrahma Bhavanalokaha Punaravartinorjuna Mamupetya tu kaunteya Punarjanmana vidyate Sahasrayuga paryantam Aharyad brahmano viduhu Ratrim yuga sahasrantam Teho ratra vido janaha Hari Om.
Thank you, Smita, for the melodious chanting of the verses soaked in Bhakti Bhava. Thank you, Dr. Timmappa Hegde, sir, for braiding together the verses, adding clarity and depth to our understanding through your insights. A heartfelt thank you to all the speakers for sharing their understanding of the verses in such a beautiful manner. Recalling today's key points, our primary relationship with this God alone. There is no individual separate from the total. Surrender is the surest means to remember God all the time. Everything belongs to God, and handing over everything to God requires practice. Change the goalpost by making God the goal and world the means. When Krishna has assured that the highest possible in life is Ishvara Prapti itself, then why settle for anything less? Hope you enjoyed listening to the session as much as we enjoyed bringing it together for you. Let's continue our Mananam and Nididhyasanam based on today's Shravanam till we meet next on the 19th of November 2021 at 6:45 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Krishnam Vande Jagadguru. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Hari Om.